The desert wind carried no sound, no scent, only silence, and yet it seemed to whisper of things to come. Somewhere beyond the Euphrates, a Roman army was marching east, not as an expedition of caution or necessity, but as a pursuit of legacy. And at its head rode Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the most powerful men in the Roman Republic, a man not born into glory but determined to buy it if he had to. Crassus was known less for victories than for his wealth, enough to bail out the entire Roman state in times of crisis, enough to own thousands of properties, slaves, and political allies. But what he didn't have, what gnawed at him with every passing triumph earned by Caesar in Gaul and Pompey in the east, was a military legacy of his own. So when the Senate handed him command of Syria and the right to wage war in the east, he didn't see borders or treaties or diplomacy, he saw opportunity. He saw a chance to become the next Alexander. And he believed the Parthians would fall like so many had before them. But Crassus didn't understand what he was walking into, not really. Rome had never fought a power like Parthia, a kingdom built not on the Roman model of conquest and legions, but on mobility, on aristocracy, on a subtle blend of strategy and surprise. It was an empire that knew it didn't need to match Rome in numbers or formation, it needed only to wait, watch, and strike where Rome was blind. And Parthia had been watching for a long time. Since their border with Rome solidified at the Euphrates, tensions had simmered under the surface. Rome's victories in Armenia and Pontus had brought them face to face with a new eastern frontier. And while the Republic dreamed of pushing deeper, the Parthians had been preparing in silence. What made this march different wasn't just the geography or the heat or the lack of cavalry support, it was the arrogance. Crassus believed that with 7 legions and a name powerful enough to bend the Roman Senate, he could walk into Mesopotamia and be greeted as a conqueror. He dismissed offers of Armenian assistance, ignored advice to take a mountainous route, and instead chose the open plains. He didn't see the danger. He saw speed. He saw headlines. He saw statues being raised in his name before the war even began. But Parthia saw something else, an overconfident general walking straight into the storm. And behind that storm stood Surena, the Parthian commander who would soon earn a place in history as the man who humbled Rome without ever needing a city to fall. Surena wasn't a household name in the Roman world. He wasn't a king. He wasn't even the supreme commander of all Parthian forces. But he was clever, charismatic, and utterly unshakable. He came from one of Parthia's most powerful noble families, a clan that could crown kings and remove them with equal ease. And unlike Crassus, Surena didn't fight for pride. He fought with precision. He didn't need a massive army to win, he just needed the right conditions and the right bait. So as Crassus crossed the Euphrates and began his march, Parthia didn't rush to meet him. It didn't panic or scatter. It waited. It watched. And slowly, it drew the Roman force further away from its supply lines, deeper into unfamiliar terrain. Crassus secured some early victories, capturing towns and scattering local resistance, but each success only pulled him further into the trap. To his men, everything seemed to be going according to plan. The enemy was retreating. The cities were surrendering. They were winning. But war isn't won on paper. And what Crassus couldn't see, what none of them could see, was that the real battle hadn't even begun. The campaign of 54 BC ended with Rome feeling confident and Parthia seemingly on the back foot. But the truth was far more dangerous. As Crassus celebrated in Syria, Surena was raising a new army, not with foot soldiers or heavy infantry, but with horse archers and cataphracts, armored cavalry designed not to hold ground, but to dance around it. He wasn't preparing to defend cities. He was preparing to lure the lion into open country and bleed it slowly, painfully, without ever letting it strike. And when Crassus resumed his advance in the spring of 53 BC, Surena was ready. His men were already in place, his tactics rehearsed, and his trap nearly set. All he needed was for Crassus to do what Roman generals always did, charge toward glory and underestimate the ground beneath their feet. Carrhae wasn't just a battlefield, it was a turning point, a moment when two worlds collided, not just armies but ideas. Rome brought its traditions, its formations, its belief in conquest as destiny. Parthia brought silence, patience, and the deadly elegance of a force that knew how to win without ever needing to look like it was fighting. And as Crassus crossed into the plains, surrounded by the sun and the silence, he thought he was writing the first page of his legacy. He had no idea it would be the last. There's a moment in every war when the illusion breaks, when the dust of pride clears and reality walks in wearing a different face than the one a general had imagined. For Crassus, that moment came not with a clash of swords or the taking of a city, but with a sound, the distant echo of hooves on hard ground and the shrill whine of arrows cutting through air. When he crossed into Mesopotamia in the spring of 53 BC, he believed the campaign would be swift. The towns that once resisted had already fallen. The opposition appeared scattered, their satraps defeated, their kings too far to react. But what Crassus didn't realize was that Parthia had never intended to meet him at the gates of a city. Their battlefield wasn't made of stone walls or narrow alleys, it was wide, open, and cruel, a vast plain of wind and space where Roman formations meant little and mobility meant everything. This was the Parthian theater, and the performance had just begun. Surinna was already there, watching, waiting. He had assembled a force unlike anything Rome had faced before, no infantry, no siege equipment, just cavalry. Thousands of horse archers, men raised in the saddle who could shoot with deadly precision while galloping at full speed, and with them, the Parthian elite, cataphracts, fully armored cavalry knights wrapped in steel from head to toe, their lances long, their presence terrifying. To Crassus, they must have looked unimpressive at first glance, lightly dressed, small in number, strange in their silence. But that was by design. Surinna had ordered his cataphracts to hide their armor beneath soft robes. He'd spread his vanguard wide, disguising his depth, shaping the perception of weakness. He knew exactly what a Roman general would think when he saw this force. And he used that thought like a weapon. Crassus, urged on by confidence and the desire to match Caesar's victories in Gaul, pushed forward. His scouts, inexperienced and unfamiliar with the terrain, blundered straight into Surinna's trap, suffering casualties but managing to warn the main force. Still, Crassus didn't hesitate. He ordered a meal, gave a brief rest, and then formed his legions into a battle-ready formation. Initially, he deployed in a long line with cavalry on each wing, a classic Roman arrangement to prevent encirclement. But then, fearing the army could be flanked more easily in such a spread, he changed his mind and reformed into a giant square, hedging his bets against an enemy he still didn't fully understand. It was a fatal decision. The square, while strong on all sides, lacked mobility. It was a formation meant to endure, not pursue. It was a defense against known threats. But the Parthians were anything but known. As the Roman soldiers advanced, they were greeted not by men, but by sound. A terrifying roar of bronze drums, echoing across the plain, followed by the sudden shimmering reveal of the cataphracts, who shed their concealing robes in unison like actors unveiling their true roles. The glint of metal must have been blinding in the Mesopotamian sun. Still, the Roman ranks held. They were disciplined. They had fought worse, or so they believed. The charge came next. Surinna ordered a headlong advance of his heavy cavalry toward the Roman square, dust billowing behind them like a storm. But just before contact, the cataphracts peeled away, turning at speed and circling the Roman formation. And then came the second act. From all directions, the horse archers moved into position, releasing a barrage of arrows with terrifying speed. The Romans responded with their testudo, interlocking shields to form a shell of protection. It had worked against other archers before. But these weren't ordinary archers, and these weren't ordinary arrows. The Parthians used composite bows, short but powerful, capable of piercing Roman armor at close range and long. Their arrows were barbed, designed not just to wound but to maim, to rip muscle when pulled out. And they never stopped. Crassus, watching from the center of the square, must have thought the attack would run out of steam. Eventually, the archers would run low on ammunition. Then the Romans could counterattack, close the distance, turn the tide. But that moment never came. Because behind the archers came camels, a mobile supply train, each carrying baskets full of arrows, spaced evenly so that no archer ever had to stop. They would rotate, fire, fall back, rearm, return. The assault was endless, and the sky was never silent. As legionaries fell, some screaming, some dying in silence, the square tightened, and still the arrows came. Hope, that most Roman of virtues, began to slip away. In desperation, Crassus ordered his son Publius, a decorated cavalry officer who had served under Caesar, to lead a breakout with 4,000 men, mostly light cavalry and auxiliary troops. Publius charged, and for a brief, flickering moment, it looked like salvation. The Parthians retreated. A window had opened. But Surina had planned for this too. The retreat was a ruse. As Publius pushed forward, he was lured into an ambush where Parthian cataphracts, now regrouped, surged in with devastating force. The Parthian archers returned, flanking his force, cutting down men from every side. Surrounded, wounded, and with no reinforcements in sight, Publius made one final command. He ordered his comrade to kill him, choosing honor over capture. His death marked the beginning of Rome's unraveling. Back at the main force, Crassus waited, unaware that the desert had already claimed his son. And soon, it would come for him too. The sun hadn't moved, but time had grown heavy. Hours had passed since Publius rode out with the breakout force, and still no word had returned. Crassus waited in the center of the square, surrounded by silence and suspicion, every heartbeat a question he couldn't answer. The air was thick with dust, sweat, and dread. Then, over the ridge, came the answer, not in the form of a messenger, not in the shape of a survivor, but in a brutal, unmistakable display. A Parthian horseman rode slowly, triumphantly, with the severed head of Publius mounted high on a lance, his features still twisted in the final echo of resistance. That single image broke more than Roman morale, it shattered the illusion that the situation could still be salvaged. Whatever pride remained was drowned beneath the weight of grief and horror. The men, hardened veterans of many wars, turned pale at the sight. Some wept. Others clenched their jaws in silence. But one thing was certain, the psychological blow had landed deeper than any arrow. Surina, ever the strategist, knew when to strike not just the body but the spirit. With the Roman square still intact but reeling, he unleashed another wave. The cataphracts charged once again, but just like before, they didn't break the line, they tested it, pressed it, forced it inward while the horse archers continued their endless storm from every direction. There was no safe side, no rest, no opening to retaliate. The square was now more a cage than a formation, tightening by the minute, each footstep forward bought with blood. Every wound was a lesson. Every Roman death a reminder that this was no longer a battle, it was a siege in the open, a slow unraveling of everything the legions stood for. As dusk fell, the assault finally eased, not from mercy but from method. Surina withdrew his forces just far enough to deny Rome even the false comfort of pursuit. The Parthians made camp close enough to be seen, close enough to remind the Romans that sleep would be a luxury they couldn't afford. Crassus, shaken and exhausted, retreated with his remaining officers to the nearby city of Carrhae. Only about half his original force remained, perhaps 20,000 men, most wounded, demoralized, and unsure whether they would see another dawn. Among his lieutenants, Gaius Cassius Longinus and Octavius pleaded for action, for movement, for anything but despair. But Crassus, once a man of unshakable will, now seemed hollowed out, haunted not just by the weight of loss but by the realization that this was a disaster of his own making. That night, under a starless sky, the retreat began. Quiet and desperate, the Romans moved through the dark, abandoning the wounded who could no longer walk, leaving them behind with whispered apologies and silent prayers. Every shadow became a threat. Every gust of wind felt like hooves returning. And panic, that most contagious of diseases, spread fast. More than once, men broke formation, believing an attack was coming. Some drew swords on their own comrades. Order unraveled as fear took command. Still, they pressed on toward the hills, toward the hope of escape, carrying the broken pieces of a once proud army. By morning, Parthian scouts had found them again. The rear guard, those too injured to move, were discovered and slaughtered where they lay. Surina, relentless and patient, resumed the chase. But he also knew that the endgame was near. Crassus had nowhere left to run. His men were low on food, low on morale, and now scattered in clusters across the hills. Carrhae, the town that once offered walls and brief respite, had been left behind. There would be no last stand, no grand counteroffensive. Just a final act in a play that had already been written. Crassus, now reduced to a man leading ghosts, sought parley. Surina, always the showman, offered terms, negotiations, safety, an end to the bloodshed. Crassus agreed, perhaps out of desperation, perhaps out of a lingering hope that something could still be saved. But the meeting was a lie. An ambush disguised as diplomacy. When Crassus and his escort approached, they were seized. His officers fought back and were cut down. Crassus himself was either killed during the struggle or executed shortly after. Some Roman sources, eager for poetic justice, later claimed molten gold was poured down his throat, a brutal metaphor for a man whose greed had driven him to destruction. Whether truth or legend, the message was clear. The East had not only defeated Rome, it had humiliated it. Back in Syria, only Gaius Cassius, commanding the survivors, managed to lead a portion of the force to safety. He would return to Rome hardened, bitter, and filled with lessons the Republic was not ready to hear. He would one day become one of the conspirators against Caesar, a man forever shaped by the nightmare of Carrhae. But in 53 BC, the legacy of this battle belonged to Parthia. It was a victory not just of tactics, but of identity. Rome, for all its discipline and ambition, had met a power it could not bend, and in doing so, had tasted defeat on a scale it hadn't known since the days of Hannibal. Carrhae would not be forgotten, not by generals, not by senators, and certainly not by history. In the silent aftermath of Carrhae, the winds that once carried the sound of war now moved through a field of the dead. The heat of the desert had not relented, but the noise had. No more war drums, no more clash of armor, only the slow breath of a land that had swallowed pride and left only dust in its place. Rome had been broken, not by siege or starvation, but by its own overconfidence, by the weight of a name that believed itself unshakable. Crassus was gone, his army in pieces, and with him fell the illusion that Roman might was universal. What remained was shame, etched into memory, scattered across the plains, and carried like a scar by every survivor who limped back to Syria. The figures speak for themselves, but they don't speak softly. Of the 42,000 men who followed Crassus across the Euphrates, more than half were dead. 4,000 were captured, enslaved, and sent eastward into a life that would never see Italy again. Some of these captives, according to distant accounts, would later appear in the service of eastern kings or vanish into frontier settlements, ghostly reminders of a war that Rome refused to remember with detail. And then there were the wounded, left behind during the panicked retreat, slaughtered without mercy by the pursuing Parthians. To the world, Rome had tasted humiliation, but to the Parthians, this was something more. This was proof. Proof that the empire they had watched from afar was not invincible, that its legions could bleed, that its generals could die with nothing more than regret in their hands. Back in the Roman Republic, the ripples of Carrhae turned into waves. The death of Crassus not only ended a campaign, it shattered the fragile political arrangement that had held the Republic together. The first triumvirate, a delicate balance of power between Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar, had always relied on uneasy cooperation. With Crassus gone, that balance collapsed. Pompey and Caesar were now two stars caught in the same sky, both too bright to coexist. The road to civil war didn't begin at Carrhae, but it quickened with every rumor that returned from the east. Rome wasn't just mourning a lost army, it was mourning a sense of control, a vision of unity that had cracked under the pressure of ambition. And what of Parthia? For all its glory at Carrhae, even victory came at a price. The architect of Rome's greatest defeat, Surena, returned home a legend. He had outmaneuvered a Roman consul, crushed an entire invasion, and gifted his king the spoils of a fallen empire. But in royal courts, glory can be dangerous. King Oroda II, perhaps threatened by Surena's rising fame and influence, had him executed soon after. The man who had rewritten the rules of war was silenced not by enemies, but by envy. It was a grim reminder that in the East as well as in the West, power devoured its own. Yet Surena's ghost lingered, not just in Parthia, but in the minds of Roman generals who would later face Parthian horse archers and remember the lesson learned too late. Carrhae also redrew the map of Roman ambition. What had once seemed like a natural eastward expansion now appeared as a wall, a cultural, tactical, and psychological frontier that Rome couldn't easily cross. From this point forward, the Euphrates River became more than a border. It became a symbol, a line between worlds. East of it lay Parthia, unpredictable, elusive, and powerful in a way that Rome had never fully prepared for. And on both sides of the river, for generations to come, Rome and Parthia would continue to circle one another, clash in bursts of blood and sand, each understanding that while battles may be won or lost, the war for dominance between empires is often fought most fiercely in the space between memory and myth. For the Roman people, the defeat at Carrhae wasn't simply a military loss, it was a crack in the identity of an empire that had taught its citizens that Roman arms were unstoppable. It forced uncomfortable questions into the public forum. Could Rome lose? Were there enemies it could not conquer? Was expansion always worth the cost? These questions echoed not only in senatorial debates but in the stories told by returning soldiers, in the quiet stares of mothers who had lost sons, and in the silence of veterans who no longer spoke of glory. The name Carrhae joined that short list of places, like Cannae, like Orazio, where Rome bled enough to doubt itself. And yet, history moves forward. Rome did not crumble. It adapted. It rebuilt. It sought vengeance in later campaigns, sometimes succeeding, often repeating the same miscalculations in new ways. The war with Parthia would continue for centuries, sometimes hot, sometimes cold, but it would never again carry the same naive confidence it had before Carrhae. From that day on, Rome would fight the East with one eye always watching the horizon and the other looking inward, at the memory of a desert where arrogance met its match. Carrhae did more than humble a general or shatter a legion, it marked the moment when Rome, so used to shaping the world around it, was forced to reckon with a world it couldn't fully control. It wasn't just a battlefield loss, it was a cultural reckoning, a moment when the mighty republic, fresh off generations of conquest, was reminded that not all victories are inevitable and not every enemy plays by the same rules. The story of Carrhae lives on not because of how it ended but because of what it revealed, that beneath Rome's iron discipline and endless ambition was a vulnerability it had refused to see, and the desert gave it no choice but to look. Crassus, a man driven not by necessity but by ego, thought he could buy greatness the way he bought influence in Rome. But the East was never for sale, and Parthia had no interest in playing the role of stepping stone for someone else's legacy. What he found instead was a force that moved differently, fought differently, and thought centuries ahead of a man still chasing shadows of Alexander. In a single campaign, he lost everything, his army, his son, his life, and with them, the illusion that Rome could stretch endlessly in every direction without consequence. But if Carrhae was the end of one story, it was the beginning of another. The defeat exposed the limits of Roman power and opened the door to a rivalry that would last for centuries. Parthia didn't collapse under Rome's might, and Rome didn't vanish after Carrhae. Instead, they adapted to one another. The Euphrates became a fault line between empires, a river not just of geography but of identity. The wars that followed would see fortunes rise and fall on both sides, but something had shifted permanently. From this point forward, the Romans approached the East not as conquerors walking into another province, but as adversaries stepping into a different world, one that fought with different rhythms, valued different things, and played the game of empire on its own terms. The men who survived Carrhae carried its memory like a wound that never closed. Some lived out their days in silence, others whispered tales of a battlefield with no walls, no safety, and no mercy. And in the Roman imagination, the Parthians became more than enemies, they became a symbol of what Rome could not bend, could not break, could not fully understand. Even generations later, Roman generals would speak of Carrhae not just as a military lesson but as a shadow cast over every Eastern campaign. The tactics that destroyed Crassus became study material for every commander who followed. But no matter how many maps they drew or formations they drilled, they never truly forgot the sound of bronze drums echoing across the flat plains and the sight of mounted warriors who refused to fight the Roman way, and won anyway. Yet beyond the battlefield, Carrhae also taught something deeper, something timeless. It showed that ambition without wisdom is dangerous, that pride without preparation is a trap, and that history rarely rewards those who chase glory with blind eyes. Crassus didn't fail because he lacked power, he failed because he didn't understand the world he was entering. And that's a lesson not just for Rome, but for anyone who imagines that strength alone is enough. Empires fall when they stop listening, when they mistake fear for respect, when they see every difference as a weakness to exploit rather than a force to be reckoned with. Carrhae whispered that truth in the language of silence and arrowheads. Even after Crassus fell, the story didn't end. His death unraveled the political structure of Rome, setting the stage for Caesar's rise and the fall of the Republic. The first triumvirate died with him, and in its place came civil war, dictatorship, and eventually empire. So in a way, the Parthians did more than defeat a Roman army, they helped change Roman history. Without Carrhae, the fragile peace between Caesar and Pompey might have endured longer. Without Carrhae, the civil wars might have taken a different path. Without Carrhae, the idea that Rome was mortal might have taken just a little longer to settle in. And yet, as history marched on, that defeat, so painful in its moment, became a kind of strange gift, a scar that warned future generations not to confuse dominance with invincibility. Today, when we look back at Carrhae, we don't just see the numbers or the geography, we see the warning it carries forward. That even the greatest powers are not immune to failure. That victory is not always earned by size or wealth, but by clarity, cunning, and respect for the battlefield. And most of all, that history is not a straight road, but a path shaped by both triumphs and defeats, each one leaving behind its own kind of legacy. Carrhae wasn't the end of Rome, but it was a turning point, a moment when a desert, a forgotten kingdom, and a man named Surina reminded the world that even giants can fall, and sometimes, the quiet victories are the ones that echo the longest. Long after the sands of Carrhae had buried its dead, the echoes of that battle continued to shape the world on both sides of the Euphrates. Time passed, emperors rose and fell, and legions marched once again toward the east, but none ever forgot what had happened on that plain where ambition died beneath a storm of hooves and arrows. The Romans, for all their resilience, never truly recovered from the shock of Carrhae, not just in numbers or prestige, but in psyche. It had become a cautionary tale, a quiet ghost that haunted every war council that followed, whispering in the ears of generals and senators alike that even Rome, in all its glory, could be humbled by the unexpected, by the unfamiliar, by the underestimated. And for the Parthians, Carrhae became something more than a victory, it became identity. It proved to themselves, and to the world, that they were not simply the distant heirs of Persian empires past, but a force that could stop Rome in its tracks, that could meet the West not with walls, but with movement, with precision, and with unshakable resolve. In the years that followed, the Parthian state grew more confident, but also more cautious. The victory had proven their strength, but it had also painted a target. Rome would not forget, and vengeance, in Roman hands, was rarely gentle. So Parthia prepared, not to expand, but to endure. Their strength remained in their cavalry, in their decentralization, in their ability to vanish and strike again. They would never build the roads or the bureaucracies of Rome, but they didn't need to. Their empire wasn't about conquering others, it was about withstanding those who tried to conquer them. And in Carrhae, they had found the blueprint for that survival. It wasn't about numbers. It wasn't about holding cities. It was about choosing the ground, choosing the moment, and making the enemy play a game they didn't understand until it was far too late to escape. Meanwhile in Rome, Carrhae sparked more than just military recalibration, it ignited political transformation. The death of Crassus ripped the last thread that had held the first triumvirate together. Without him, the uneasy balance between Caesar and Pompey collapsed into rivalry, then into war. Within 6 years of Carrhae, Caesar would cross the Rubicon, civil war would tear the Republic apart, and the age of emperors would begin. And though Carrhae did not cause the collapse of the Republic, it served as a silent catalyst. It removed one of its wealthiest and most influential power brokers. It exposed the Senate's inability to control its own generals. And it reminded everyone in Rome that military glory could be a dangerous drug, one that drove men to risk everything for the chance to carve their names into the marble of history. But perhaps the strangest part of the story lies not in strategy or politics, but in the fate of those who vanished. Thousands of Roman soldiers captured at Carrhae were never seen again by the Republic. Some historians believe they were taken deep into the east, resettled along the borders of the Kushan or Han empires, possibly even used as border guards in lands so distant they no longer carried Latin in their speech. Imagine, Roman legionaries, trained in Italy, seasoned in Gaul, now building lives in Central Asia, intermarried, forgotten, and yet living proof of how far the consequences of a single defeat could reach. Their stories may never be fully known, but their disappearance remains one of the great mysteries of Roman history, a quiet reminder that empire isn't just about the battles we record, but about the people history loses along the way. As the decades turned to centuries, Carrhae never faded from memory. It lived on in Roman military doctrine, in speeches and Senate debates, in cautionary writings by men who feared another Eastern campaign might end the same way. And for Parthia, the legacy of Surina, though cut short by royal jealousy, became mythologized. He was the man who had brought Rome to its knees with fewer men, smarter tactics, and a vision of warfare built on speed, precision, and terrain. Though he was killed by his own king, his legend outlived his enemies. And in every future clash between East and West, from Antony's failed campaign to the later wars with the Sassanids, the spirit of Carrhae lingered. Not as a moment frozen in time, but as a living echo of what happens when pride meets preparation, when tradition faces innovation, and when one man's hunger for glory forgets to ask what lies on the other side of the river. Carrhae was more than a defeat. It was a mirror. It forced Rome to see itself not as the center of the world, but as one power among many, capable of failure, susceptible to misjudgment, and vulnerable when it stopped listening to the world beyond its borders. And it forced Parthia to believe in its own strength, not just as a footnote in someone else's empire, but as a civilization with its own rules, its own vision, and its own place in history. The battle ended in a day, but the consequences rippled through generations. Because sometimes, the greatest shifts in history don't come from the largest wars, they come from the one defeat no one expected. In the centuries that followed Carrhae, as Rome transformed from a republic into an empire and Parthia eventually gave way to the Sassanids, the memory of that desert disaster remained like a scar beneath the surface of both civilizations, a reminder not only of what was lost, but of how history often pivots on a single day no one expected to matter as much as it did. And perhaps the strangest thing is this: for all the grandeur Rome achieved after Carrhae, for all the emperors, roads, and monuments that came to define its legacy, the ghosts of that one defeat never really left its shadow. Carrhae endured because it wasn't just a military loss, it was a philosophical shock to a people raised on conquest. Rome had built itself on the idea that all enemies were either future subjects or future lessons. But Parthia didn't fit that mold. It couldn't be annexed like Gaul or bribed like Greek city-states. It didn't crumble under siege, and it didn't fear Roman banners. Instead, it taught Rome something it had rarely been forced to learn, that victory has limits, and so does power. What's remarkable is how quietly Carrhae shaped the wars that came after it. The Roman generals who followed, Antony, Trajan, even Septimius Severus, each stepped cautiously where Crassus had charged blindly. Antony brought siege equipment and massive supply lines, but still found himself retreating in the face of Parthian mobility. Trajan, perhaps Rome's most accomplished conqueror after Caesar, managed to temporarily seize Mesopotamia, but even he, in the end, pulled back, understanding that conquest in the east wasn't about holding cities, but about surviving distance, heat, and a style of warfare Rome was never built to master. Even emperors who never fought the Parthians directly still ruled beneath the long shadow of that loss. Augustus, the great architect of the Pax Romana, chose not to avenge Carrhae with war, but with diplomacy. He negotiated the symbolic return of the captured legionary standards, the same ones taken from Crassus's legions and paraded through Parthian courts like trophies. It was a calculated gesture of pride masked as peace, a way of rewriting the memory without risking another disaster. But for all Rome's efforts to bury or rewrite Carrhae, Parthia remembered. It wasn't just a military victory, it became cultural currency, a symbol of their ability to match, resist, and even defeat the mightiest empire the world had seen. In Parthian art, the horse archer, the very figure who encircled Crassus's doomed legions, became iconic, a symbol not only of martial skill but of national identity. Surina's name, though suppressed in his lifetime, grew into legend, whispered through Persian dynasties as the man who stopped Rome at its peak. And while Parthia itself would eventually fall, absorbed and transformed into the Sassanid Empire, the lessons of Carrhae lived on. The Sassanids would later stand against Rome, then Byzantium, with a similar strategy: fluid defense, sudden assault, deep knowledge of terrain, and the ability to weaponize patience as much as force. In many ways, Carrhae marks the beginning of a new kind of conflict in history, not just between two armies, but between two worldviews. On one side, the Roman model, centralized, disciplined, built for conquest and assimilation. On the other, the Parthian model, decentralized, adaptable, built for endurance and resistance. Neither could truly destroy the other. Instead, they engaged in a cold, simmering rivalry that would continue through successor states for over 600 years. And in that long twilight between Rome and Persia, Carrhae remained the spark that had lit the fire. Even today, when historians speak of Roman defeats, Carrhae is mentioned with a certain reverence. Not just because it was costly, not just because it changed Roman politics, but because it shattered an illusion. It reminded the world that even the most organized, most powerful, most seemingly unstoppable force can be brought low by a people who know their land, know their tactics, and know how to wait for the perfect moment to strike. That kind of defeat doesn't just sting, it humbles. And humility, rare as it was in Roman politics, became a necessary ingredient in the empire's long-term survival. Carrhae taught restraint. It taught respect. And it taught generations of Roman commanders that honor lies not in reckless bravery, but in preparation, patience, and a deep respect for one's enemy. So when we look back on Carrhae, we shouldn't see it as a final act or even as a tragedy. We should see it as a lesson that rippled far beyond the battlefield, far beyond the Euphrates, and far beyond the age of Rome itself. It was a moment when two civilizations saw each other clearly, not as caricatures, not as enemies to be crushed, but as rivals worth fearing, respecting, and ultimately coexisting with. And in that recognition, as painful and as bloody as it was, there lies something profoundly human. Because history is not only shaped by the victories we celebrate, but by the defeats we never forget.